to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. This podcast is sponsored by YakkerTech, softball's first in-game optical tracking system and most accurate data capturing solution. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. This is Series 2, Episode 3. We have a little bit of a different look today. So Karli and I, thankfully, are healthy and well, but considering world circumstances, a lot of illnesses going around, we have been wearing masks in our office around each other to prevent the spread of anything. So to avoid any sound issues with masks, Karli and I are just going to go ahead and record this one on Zoom. So hopefully sound quality comes through and we'll get rolling. Karli, welcome back to Redefine the Circle, Episode 3 here. For those of you who have not tuned in yet, this is your first episode of Series 2. We are talking all about strength and conditioning for pitchers. So this whole series, Karli Sewell is our head strength coach here at S2 Breakthrough, and it's been such a pleasure to really have her on and for us to talk all things in your area of expertise. So again, Karli, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for not kicking me off yet.
Yeah, so we are today going to talk about all things mobility, which doesn't really sound like that interesting of a topic, but it is a topic that is so important and is a topic that, as you know, that at S2 Breakthrough, we actually spend a lot of time talking about and looking at from an athlete standpoint. But, I just think really kind of highlighting what mobility is, what place it has in our system, what kind of role it plays, why it's so important, how it affects the pitching motion, how it affects training. I think today's episode will be really informative.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's start with just like basic question here. Can you start with what is mobility? So obviously in our assessment, we talk about kind of having these three tiers or these three categories of movement that we're assessing before we even get into the pitching motion. And we're talking mobility, what we call movement capacity, and then like speed and power. These are the types of things that we're measuring outside of the motion. Let's start with mobility. What is it? How is it different from the other categories of movement that we measure?
So to simplify it, mobility is joint health. So the ability to move your joint in the full range of motion and to control that and to have that ability, that's mobility. So when we talk about an athlete being able to actively pursue mobility, we're talking about them being able to have adequate joint health to withstand the demands of softball mechanics, especially for pitchers.
And so mobility, like we talk about here, is you either have it or you don't, right? Like you could have excessive, but you still have it. This is not like when I say like, what's the difference between mobility and movement capacity? We say movement capacity is basically trunk control. It's trunk control, period. And how basically, as we're putting you through a variety of exercises at a variety of intensities and different planes of movement, when does the trunk break down and when do compensations emerge, right? So that's really movement capacity. But mobility is like, can you access these positions or not? Do you have a normal range of motion? Sometimes there's an excessive range of motion, rarely, but sometimes there's an excessive range of motion. And then it's not there. It doesn't exist, right? And so it's really what we have done in our assessment is be able to essentially look at the pitching motion, starting with the biomechanics after collecting a lot of data, a lot of research, and looking at what are the positions that are required in order to load muscle groups appropriately in the pitching motion, right? And so that's really where mobility starts for us. Okay, so when we're talking about mobility, let's talk about we assess an athlete and we see that she has is what we would say red, right? Like a lot of reds in her mobility score. What does that mean? And how do we start to influence that? So I know that like I can't change mobility as a pitching person. So I think, there was a time where assessments started to become really popular, and the way in which coaches were sort of like handling mobility was they would say like, okay, this athlete doesn't have a lot of ankle mobility. And so they would like jump out of the cage, do some things for ankle mobility, and then like jump in and see if it worked, if that makes sense. Like this like instant access it and come back in. And we know now that that's not an appropriate way to really work through mobility. So when we identify that mobility should be changed, how do we go about doing that? I sort of like rely on the things that you're doing in warm-ups and workouts. And I'll talk a little bit about my side of what I do with that. But can you start with your side? What does that mean when we say like, XYZ mobility pieces have to really be focused on for this athlete? What do you do?
Yeah. So looking at the assessment and seeing first of all, what is a mobility issue that needs to be addressed, finding that out. And then it goes to what is the root of that mobility issue? Because a lot of the times when we see a mobility issue, it's often not what it's presented as. It's something that is causing that under maybe a different joint, or maybe the pitcher has an anatomical structure that is limiting her capacity and movement, or causing mechanics to be different, which mechanics then link into mobility. So it's always knowing that whatever you see, there's something under it that you probably need to address first to then fix that.
So give me some specific examples here. Like, let's literally say we'll measure like, ankle mobility, essentially, particularly like on dominant side, being able to appropriately apply force into the ground, non-dominant side, being able to effectively absorb force, grounds up. When these are compromised, they can have some negative effects on the pitcher and her pitching motion. So if I say like, okay, ankle mobility, this is probably not a great example because we're not ever like super focused on ankle mobility. But what I mean is I want you to talk to me about like, it's not just ankle mobility in a silo, right? You're not just like hammering their ankles. Can you give me an example of like how you actually try to influence something like ankle mobility?
Yeah, so I actually think that's a pretty good one to talk about. So ankle mobility in pitchers, that's like one of the first things I see go in season travel ball in high school. And the reason for that is because of the active hip extension that they're having to recruit throughout the season. So they're in so much hip extension, and then the loss of hip mobility during the season is typically going to feed into that ankle mobility. So it's not actually the ankle that we're chasing. It's like when you're trying to fix a TV and you're hitting the signal instead of actually fixing the TV. That's the same thing with addressing ankle mobility. It's like you can address that and that will maybe fix that. But to really address it, you have to make those hips more mobile and more stable. And then the athlete can achieve the ankle mobility that you want.
Sure. So I think you're right. I think it's actually a great example, this concept of like, basically remembering that everything we do, the way our brains operate here at S2 is the symptoms versus roots concept, which is like really redefine the circle could be called like symptoms versus roots. I mean, it's the underlying deal of everything we talk about. And so again, just kind of talking about, I think the relationship that we've had, it's come to light to us as coaches that something like you have to be able to have access to this movement in order to do the motion. Like that itself is a really powerful concept that sort of started to like infiltrate into our like teaching culture and just coaching in general. But how to do it is like a mystery. This like, okay, then go do some like ankle work and then come back in the cage. It's important to really understand, as we have found, like it's the trunk. Or it is the trunk. It's really the center of the body and its lack of stability, essentially, that then like infiltrates throughout the limbs and the rest of the body, like proximal to distal, right?
Yeah,
so that's really why ankle mobility is a great example.
Yeah, that's a good point. So like you're saying, proximal feeds distal. So as soon as the middle of the body starts to be lost, range of motion, stability, that's going to feed down to the limb. So even shoulder issues can be traced to, like we always see, lumbopelvic stability issues, ankles to the hips, knees to the hips. So it's always a deeper layer than what you're actually seeing.
So just to summarize, your answer to when you're looking at someone's mobility is that you want to look at what mobility is compromised and find sort of its common root. right? Like, where's the root of why mobility is going away? And I'm going to attack that. I'm going to attack that in their warm-ups. I'm going to attack that in their workout itself, in their program, I should say. And really the expectation then is that when that stabilizes, then all of a sudden now I regain mobility elsewhere.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah. And so sort of like this concept of like joint by joint approach that you always talk about. And I think you referenced like early on in episode 1. So if ankles, for example, are supposed to be mobile and like hips, you know, if we're talking like back up the chain, the trunk is supposed to be more stable. If we lose stability essentially in the trunk, then essentially as we're working down, we're trying to stabilize there. We're sort of locking up further away, like more distally, right? Did I put that okay?
Yeah, that was good.
Okay. Yeah. And so like, that's the concept, like keep it stable in the middle to allow more mobility, more like variability of movement as you get further away from the trunk, which is really what we're talking about. I mean, that's pitching. That is absolutely pitching. It's just like, we need the arms, we need the levers essentially to be really relaxed. They cannot be our source of like tension and stiffness because they don't transfer energy well that way. They don't get on time well. They don't transfer energy well. So how do we keep the levers really fluid essentially is what we're talking about. We keep the trunk stable. And so this concept of like mobility and movement capacity are so closely related. If movement capacity is about trunk stability and mobility is about like how trunk stability is affecting your other joints, essentially. That's really how the story comes together, correct?
Yeah, we've talked about this before. Mobility and movement capacity are two-way street. So if you have mobility, odds are you have movement capacity in that plane or that range of motion. And if you don't, then you probably don't have mobility in the other ways. So these feed each other. It's not just mobility and then movement capacity. These are feeding each other. And in order to be an optimal mover, you have to have both, and you have to have them in all three planes to be a successful softball player.
You had a conversation a few months ago with a Division I strength coach and Power 5 strength coach who's, you know, just sort of like a little bit like a mentoring conversation, asking some questions, going back and forth. And that strength coach said to you, I never saw mobility as like on my plate until this conversation. I always thought it was something like that the AT would take care of, essentially, right? Or it's like a concept that they bring to me and I'm just the strength floor. Can you maybe just kind of summarize how that conversation went and what some of your main points were in that conversation?
Yeah, so we performed assessments for them, and with the assessments, they got the mobility screen back. And so we were talking about how to navigate it programming wise, warm-up wise. And when we were talking about warm-ups, I was talking about how to basically program warm-ups to address and attack mobility deficiencies. And that's when you brought up, well, that's the AT's job, and that's how it's always been. When it comes to performance, mobility is performance, and having the ability to move your joints and be optimal through that and have a functioning kinetic chain, that is performance. And so if we really want to bridge the gap and if we want to create stronger athletes, that has to be done on our side. I think in the past, it has been the AT's job, but that's a different type of mobility. That's flexibility as I see it, because oftentimes when we're going through those range of motions, it's passive. So the athlete's not actively getting there. It's typically the AT holding the shoulder and being cranked through, which that's fine. It has its time and place, but that's not for high performance, and that's not to fix deficiencies. So when we talk about fixing and addressing mobility, it's about creating better body-brain awareness. And in order to do this, we have to have better proprioception and kinesthetic awareness of where our joints are in space. So to do this, we need to start out on the ground and work up and really get a feel of where our joint positioning is. If we need those hips to be stable, we need to start on the ground, really feel where our hips are in space, and then move up to standing and do maybe easier movement, but now we're standing, and now we diminish the learning curve of how to use our hips, and now we can actually do that.
Yeah. I would say, that makes total sense to me, just as far as like why mobility is on the plate of the strength coach. And from my standpoint as the pitching person, I need to be in the know, because if anything, while I am not going to actively change it, Certainly not like on the spot. That's not how mobility works. It does explain to me why a pitcher sort of creates the compensations she does. And so this concept of root versus symptoms is really important for pitching coaches, because what historically really has happened in the pitching community is that what our eye sees are compensations, and we're sort of just like trying to trade compensations, like don't put your glove out here, instead step over here. We're just changing like limb positions, when in reality, understanding like, here's the trunk stability, here's where it breaks down, here's how she uses her levers to make up for that, and so here's how it's impacting mobility. Like really seeing that full story and watching as you're attacking it. And we're remeasuring mobility, which we'll talk about at the end of today's episode. And we're remeasuring that and waiting to see some change for me to be able to like connect. Okay, then I would expect, since this is now open for her, or this is now clear in this mobility piece, I would expect now that she can use this limb differently, or she can do this differently. So what I feel like from my standpoint, not only just being in the know, but then also making sure that when my athletes are going through their like prep work, their plyo, all their low intensity stuff, I am basically not asking them to do something that I know they're just not quite capable of yet. I'm not trying to change or manipulate something that right now is just their strategy for a lack of trunk control.
Right.
I think that's just sort of the summary, right? I am just closely monitoring that story. I understand the story. I understand why they're utilizing the compensations they do, how mobility is linked to that. And then I'm really just watching that reassessment piece and waiting for those things to start changing.
Well, I think it's also knowing that that's not the time or place for that athlete to be learning that movement, because you're often doing higher intensity movements with them that are going full speed, pitching. So it's capitalizing on what they're really good at, and then I'll work the lower intensity, the learning stuff on my end. So then when they get to your end, they're even better.
Right. How about some times where we don't want mobility to change? Like we see that it's locked up and we don't think that maybe it's a good idea for it to ever change or to attack it, maybe ever, versus in a certain time period. What are some examples of that?
So in season, for sure, when you start seeing mobility and maybe go down, that's not the time or the place to do it. With new mobility comes a new range of motion to own. And if you're talking about capitalizing strength and power during season, the last thing you want to do is go add an extra layer or range of motion in season. With a ton of games, a lot of throwing, range of motion of the shoulder is probably going to go down. But these athletes, they are good compensators. That's the plus and the minus of the sport. So that's not the time to then go crank range of motion. Secondly, when an athlete is really good, has a great movement capacity and mobility deficiencies, it's a time to look into the movement capacity and go, okay, maybe there's a structure issue here, and that's why the mobility issues are here. And I can't crank on this athlete because she already moves well. That doesn't matter. I just need her to keep these movements and keep her healthy. So I'm going to maintain what she has.
From my standpoint, just kind of talking about your second point, also, the majority of the time when the trunk breaks down in the motion, the overwhelming majority of the time, athletes, when they create compensations for that breakdown, it becomes an inefficiency in their motion. Overwhelming majority of the time. That's just like the nature of it becomes a less efficient kinetic chain. However, there are a handful of athletes. This is when you hear the phrase like, the elite athletes are the elite compensators. It's not that they have perfect trunk control usually. So sometimes they have, obviously their trunk control is much better than others. But oftentimes what I see is that they have some sort of compensation they tap into when their trunk breaks down that actually helps the motion, like helps them recover. It's actually a good recovery strategy. And that's not usually the case, but sometimes it is. And so it is important from my standpoint and for your standpoint to also understand like this mobility is like this because she does this in the motion, but we don't want that to change because it works. And that's freakish about her. Right. And so I think that that's really important. This is not the majority of the time, but it is important to understand that like we're not just trying to make everyone look the same. And especially as we're having conversations about higher level athletes, college athletes here, you have to understand like what is it that makes them good? What got them there in the first place? What makes them special? And there are some times where that is linked to a mobility piece, something they utilize. Maybe it's something they utilize in their levers. And because they're utilizing that strategy so much, it's actually locked down in their mobility profile. But we don't want to adjust that. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I think a good example, we had a level 4 mover last year, but she never cleared right side lat mobility. She never cleared it. But the way she was compensating in her motion was insane, and it worked for her. And we know that she has structure deficiencies where that's part of it. So just keeping her healthy, and the main strategy was keep her on the strength floor, keep her healthy. That was the only thing.
Okay, so we have there's probably two, like they're related, and I would call them like the big mobility pieces like that we see issues with pitchers. And the majority of the time, these are not things like we are addressing this. And we just see like a major, over 70% of athletes that we initially assess, we're going to talk about lat here and thoracic mobility, like lat mobility, a lack of lat mobility, I should say, on the dominant side for pitchers is like over 70% in our initial assessment. We've talked about this in like educational series in the past, but the lat has a huge role in the pitching motion. It's at such a stretched position. It's responsible for helping us get overhead, helping us get into layback, helping us work internally to rotate. It has a big role, and the repetition of pitching just essentially beats it down. And so lat mobility is a major issue because as the lat shortens, it transfers energy a little bit less efficiently than we need it to when the lat is not at full length. It limits oftentimes what layback position we can get into. It alters trunk arm timing because the arm sort of gets locked into, one way of movement, one pace of movement, essentially doesn't have a lot of variability. So there's a lot of reasons why lat mobility being locked is not great. There are extenuating circumstances, of course, there are for anything, but for the most of the time, if someone's lat mobility unlocked, I would never be unhappy. I would just be like celebrating that. Right. And then thoracic mobility is one. Thoracic mobility is thoracic rotation, I should say specifically. Thoracic rotation is one that we measure that breaks down a lot, especially in season. These are the two that really break down quickly. And what I have seen as I've linked it to their biomechanics is that as soon as an athlete's trunk stability starts to diminish, then the way in which they are rotating, and obviously anything in our game is highly rotational. Pitching is incredibly rotational as we're rotating in two directions. But as that athlete starts to lose posture, they start to rotate through thoracic extension or lumbar extension typically because they're just losing that trunk stability. And so when they start using extension as a means to rotate, then thoracic mobility declines. And now all of a sudden, like they don't have that rotational capacity anymore. That's sort of the cycle that we see, right? Okay, so can we just talk about lat mobility and thoracic rotation, how you see those two concepts through your eyes on the strength floor, how you're working with athletes to sort of, when you talk about like keeping them resilient, for the pitching motion, like these are two that if all of our athletes had clean lat and clean thoracic rotation, it'd be like it'd be like jackpot. So what's our plan of attack to sort of get athletes there?
Yeah, so basically the lat is falling victim to thoracic rotation, thoracic extension, and a little bit of scapular stability. So the number one thing, if I start seeing someone decline in lat mobility, or even just to protect someone, they're a new athlete to us, maybe they are a lower level athlete, we're not doing any pressing, we're not doing any rowing yet, we're purely focused on stabilizing through our scapular region and learning how to mobilize our thoracic region. That is the only thing that we're doing. And same type of thing when we're working on someone who's maybe declined in lat mobility. So I'm going to do this with them, and also note too that as the pitching volume goes up, so it's important to know where they are in season, as the pitching volume goes up and they are pitching with this lat mobility issue, the fibers of the lat will actually start pulling on the pelvis. So now not only do I have a lat mobility issue, which is actually a thoracic issue, but now I have a lumbopelvic issue because the lat's now pulling on the lumbopelvic region. So it's like, now I need to go back in and restabilize this athlete in lumbopelvic stability and keep building on the lat. So it's a two-way street of that as well. You have to know that the lat is going to feed the pelvis and also the upper body. And that's why it takes such a hit in pitching, is because those are the two things that pitchers need: lumbopelvic stability, thoracic mobility.
Can you give some examples of the types of like specific exercises that maybe progressive examples? Like, here's an example of how I would really try to get this athlete to achieve full lat length. We're talking about maybe a like high school, college athlete. They have maybe like average trunk stability to high level trunk stability, and we're trying to go for that lat. What are some specific things that you would do and why?
So first thing I'm going to start off with is a dead bug. So they're stabilizing through the ground. They're using their trunk to stabilize as they're achieving that overhead position. And so that overhead position, now they're going to learn how to fully do that in hip extension while stabilizing. From the dead bug, we're going to go to a bear crawl. So now they're getting a little bit of upward rotation in their shoulder, as well as stabilizing, a little bit of thoracic flexion that they're owning, as well as full length of the hip as well. And then we'll start rowing. So now we go with a knee supported row. So knee supported to help the body stabilize. And now we're going back into the row to provide more rhythm to the scapula rib cage, which will also feed that thoracic mobility. And doing this offset, so only one dumbbell at a time, reiterates the thoracic rotation, thoracic extension hammer point of that.
What about when I usually see some of our pitchers like hanging some sort of like eccentric, like pull downs essentially?
Yeah,
like,
so we do hanging knee raises as well in warm up. So if I start seeing lat issues decline, I'll add hanging knee raises, and that will be to address, like you said, kind of the isometric eccentric loading of the lat and thoracic extension, as well as now when we raise those knees up, we're getting the pelvis to posteriorly tilt under. So not only am I changing the lat length, we're trying to change that lat length, I'm also getting the pelvis to posteriorly tilt, which will then stretch the lat even more.
So here's how I think about in like, pitching coach terms, in like layperson's term from a strength and conditioning standpoint. Here's how I think about what you do when it comes to lat mobility. You identify where is the level of support that I need to give them to achieve good trunk stability in order to get that length, that lat at good length. Right. And so when you say something like dead bug, that is like the lowest level of, I should say the highest level of support you need to provide them, the lowest level of trunk stability. They're in a supine position connected to the ground to provide that. And then you're getting them in full lat length. So it's like sort of reteaching the lat to lengthen when you provide the environment of support, and then just identifying. Is that correct? Is that a good way to think about it?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things I most often see with someone who is lacking shoulder flexion from a lat mobility issue, people want to go in and automatically start pressing with that athlete, reteach them how to shoulder press. The shoulder pressing isn't going to feed the change. So when you have an athlete who has this deficiency and you put them through a shoulder press, you're not loading the muscle there. You're not changing anything at the muscular level. You're actually loading the structure. So nothing is changing. You're just making it worse. So in order to load the muscle, you then have to fix the structure. So none of our athletes who have these deficiencies are pressing. In fact, almost none of our level 1 kids press because they don't have scapular stability. So it's something that you have to earn in order to see change.
Yeah. I think of like that really could summarize like S2 strength and conditioning. It's like, we're not just here to feed the beast. You're not here to like beat on your chest and say like, these athletes are so strong with a 1 RM of this. And, this is, just of like, their patterns are exactly as is. I've changed none of the way in which they move, but they can load like beasts, which is very much a mindset in the strength and conditioning world. You are understanding that your job, this is kind of going back to how we summarize like our conversation in episode 1, but your job is to make sure that what you are doing on the strength floor is giving them the opportunity to start building more efficient patterns in their skill, right? And then obviously make those patterns stronger and stronger and faster and faster. And that's a really clear, that is why symptoms versus roots is absolutely critical, right? Symptoms versus roots is kind of like get at the reason why these things are unraveling and start there, because then change can really happen. And I just think that's a great way to really summarize like what it is that we do here. What about thoracic? It's like thoracic rotation, thoracic extension, lat mobility, this like concept of what I see from pitchers is that as soon as they start rotating through extension, then thoracic rotation goes down. This has an impact on lat mobility. Like what's that relationship? What does that look like from your eyes?
Yeah. So when an athlete is unable to gain or achieve thoracic rotation, what that often is scapula not in the right place. They can't actually open their chest. It will present as tight pecs. So I know off the top of my head, this athlete's not doing any horizontal pressing. And it's kind of the same approach here, except now we're doing more horizontal pressing because I know I need to get the scapula back involved, maybe get the pecs, so to speak, loosened up. And maybe even some AC joint that needs to be reopened up and they need to learn how to use that. So same approach here, just going with horizontal pressing. So maybe we start in a bear crawl position and we're just holding a bear crawl, and then we go with a farmer carry, and then we finally go with a dumbbell press. So once again, same order of events. And you'll notice with doing these, even if you're just stabilizing, so holding that bear crawl, or doing a farmer carry. And then if you ask the athlete to perform thoracic rotation after that, you'll see such a difference. And it's because you've given them the ability to kind of reset the upper body.
Yeah, I think it's like you're attacking everything in disguise, right? Like it's like not everything is not so just like direct, like you need more lat mobility, like raise your arm above your head, right? Like that would be something where it looks so obvious for you. It's almost like everything is in disguise because of this concept. You know, I can achieve this by attacking this, right? And I'm going to attack the root and watch for the symptom to start moving differently, to start changing. I would say, the reason why we know that our strategies typically, they're always evolving, of course, but our strategies are obviously on the right path is because we remeasure everything. We have talked about this in our second episode with assessments. It's like we remeasure and it holds us accountable. So if we have athletes that have really poor mobility and it doesn't change, we wouldn't be on this podcast talking about the types of things we do for mobility, right? Because we would say like, we haven't figured that out yet. We're still working through that process. But that's when it's pretty clear. It's very rare when we have athletes. We are typically remeasuring mobility usually every 6 weeks, and then usually for pitchers, if they're in season, sometimes I like it to be every 4 weeks, and maybe that's just for specific pitchers, but just because it unravels so quickly, I like to see their mobility, like us to have a good picture of making sure we're staying on top of it, essentially. But it's rare for us to have athletes whose mobility does not improve when they're going through our system. And I think another piece that really kind of blew me away this summer was an unintentional little case study for us. But we decided that over the summer, just in getting feedback from our remote athletes, like just how overwhelmed they were. They were like, we're finished tournaments on Monday, then we're traveling again on Wednesday to go to our next place across the country. Like it is crazy. These kids have no chance to like train. If they do, like our remote athletes were like in the hotel room one day a week, just doing like a mini workout that we had prescribed. But what we decided to do for our athletes was like, listen, the goal of these next 6 weeks of your summer season is to preserve the body, right? It's not games anymore. It's just preserve the body, keep it from unraveling. And so what we did was we would have them on Mondays fill out their whole questionnaire, their wellness questionnaire that was a little bit more specific. They had to report volume, just like general ranges of volume, intensity, how their body was feeling. You had very particular active recovery things for them to do. They might say like on day 2, they still felt that way. Then you would have an additional active recovery thing to do. And everything was geared less around like this training mindset and more about like care for my body, like preserve my body. And it really blew me away because it was probably about 50-50, just kind of accidentally, 50% of our remote athletes that were following this very well and 50 that weren't. And when we in August reassessed mobility, like it blew me away. Just the athletes that were really in this system of active recovery and doing their dynamic warm-ups and reporting how their bodies were feeling, they preserved mobility. And if they went down, it was like very minimally, like, okay, hamstrings or something, and versus like some things we saw, if we have 10 exercises of mobility, we had athletes who were like fully green, turned fully red. over the course of the summer. And so like I have, I guess, 2 points to make about that. Not only is that just so telling that there are ways to help athletes in season, and just because they're in season and so busy doesn't mean it's just like now they're just, thrown to the wolves and whatever happens. There are things to do to help them like stay in it. And I think the other point that I want to make is that like for all coaches out there involved in the system where more games is more games is more is more is more is more is more. What we see from our end as we're measuring things is that we are destroying our kids' bodies. We are destroying, and they don't know how to preserve those things because this is not the stuff that we're giving to them yet. And so it is so important for us to like start listening to this concept. We are watching mobility just get destroyed, movement capacity go down, and their season is 10 months long. So like, when are these athletes supposed to really build that back up? So that's sort of a side note. And that's my little like, public service announcement here. But swinging back into us saying like, you really helped create an approach to preserve these pitchers and it blew me away. Are there things that you want to add? Obviously, we're just wrapping up here, but things that you want to add about like how we attacked that concept and that system for those athletes in that preservation process?
Yeah, so it took me a week to kind of think about how I wanted to attack that. 2 strength days is what I came up with. So they were training twice a week, maybe. Like you said, one was typically in a hotel room or hotel strength room, and one maybe a gym, their home gym or something that they had at home. So I had one high output day and then I had one low output day. So my high output day was a high central nervous system day, meaning we were either loading heavy or we were moving fast. We were moving load fast. And typically we were just loading heavy and maybe doing time under tension. And so that was our day. We could really go in, load some weight, move fast. Then the low output day, I was making sure the athlete was not stabilizing themselves because typically in 2 days they were playing 10 games. And we were addressing the changes that they needed to make. So athlete wasn't stabilizing. They were making the changes they needed to make, and we were going high volume. I was able to do high volume because the athlete wasn't stabilizing. So even though it was low output, we were doing lower load, the athlete wasn't stabilizing, and we were doing higher volume. So it was more of a movement changing motor control day is what you could also call it. And with that, I saw a lot of change, and then I ended up adding a 3rd day of active recovery, 15 minutes of continuous movement, keeping the heart rate between 120, 135 beats per minute. And it was mostly all ground-based to ensure that, once again, the athlete wasn't stabilizing themselves and the movements that they were achieving were optimal, meaning that they were feeding the right proprioception, kinesthetic awareness, because the whole weekend they were getting destroyed by having to stabilize themselves. So kind of feed the body movement back that they need to explore.
Yeah. Well, it was a brilliant approach. There's no doubt about it. Really, the results blew me away. And kind of like, again, we didn't set it up to be a case study. It just kind of turned out to be like that. What I want to say just in closing here is like, this is probably maybe like a toughest conversation to follow from the standpoint, like it got a little heavy in this conversation. I think that's fine. More than fine. What I really want to just really highlight is, in my mind, Karli, what makes you so special and so critical to our system is that, the athletes, they know generally how their mobility, they know that you are writing them things to help them with their mobility, end of story. And they know that their mobility, what it does, like how it's impacting their motion, end of story. And they kind of just like trust us to be building something. But all these concepts of like, they didn't know that their day 1, their day 2, their active recovery was like built with that level of thoughtfulness and detail because it's too much for them. Right. But it is happening behind the scenes. And I think like what we're trying to really bring to light here is that like what you do such an incredible job of is really just understanding, again, how your role is supposed to be really intertwined. And essentially like, I really can't help them at all unless you do. Right. And so helping them is not just feeding the beast, not just making their current patterns bigger, faster, stronger. It's changing their patterns and how allowing them to bring them through. And honestly, I think like this is a piece that I just want to like shout from the rooftops, because in current social media culture where the flashier, the better. If it's flashy, it looks progressive, it must be right. that's kind of like what the world is kind of shifting toward right now, or has been shifting toward. And the reality is a lot of the things that I feel like I see on social media are pitching coaches trying to do strength and conditioning concepts. And in reality, and try to make them look like pitching. Like, we're doing strength and conditioning, we're doing trunk stability, we're doing mobility, we're opening up, hip mobility and femoral mobility, and we're throwing a ball at the same time. And the reality is that, yes, these are intertwined concepts, but they're handled by two different brains. And you are, in my mind, there is no doubt about it, the best brain in the country when it comes to this concept. And that is really why, again, even if sometimes these conversations get really meaty, at the end of the day, what I want pitching coaches, athletes, parents to really hear is that, like, making sure that this area for you is being handled well is critical. Start to ask the right questions. And now I just think, like, I'm kind of putting it on the strength and conditioning world. Like, we've got to bring this up, right? Like, we've got to start to elevate the strength and conditioning world for softball players, for pitchers, which is the point of the even kicking off this series of Redefine the Circle. Obviously then hopefully that you will have your own spinoff to be able to continue these conversations with other strength coaches. But it's so critical. It's been such like an amazing part of our system. It's a piece that's misunderstood and has not really been being done well, I think, elsewhere in the pitching world. And I just want to take this opportunity to say, like, thank you for, like, your brain, your expertise, for constantly working and seeing your role in it's like how connected it is to really making pitchers better and really just like better, not in the now, but better also as their careers go on and on and on. So not only thanks for coming back to Redefine the Circle, but thanks for all you do, for all that brain power you give us, Carl. Okay, so this is a long one. This is a meaty one. Looking forward to getting some feedback, because this is probably like part for strength and conditioning coach to get involved and listen to as well, in addition to pitching coaches. But that's really kind of where we're moving. We've got 2 episodes left with Karli, with you and I, to talk specifically about pitching and strength and conditioning. So looking forward to those. We're going to be talking about next week, like how pain, we manage when athletes are starting to have pain, what that system looks like for us here at S2 Breakthrough. And then finally, something that's maybe a little more nitty gritty with strength coaches, of like the level of detail that you go in when you're writing programs. So if for pitching coaches out there, if you haven't shared this with your strength coaches yet, do so, because it's only going to get better and better. Thanks again, Car, for joining us. And thank you to everyone who's out there listening and watching. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.